Despite its portrayal in media and films, serial killing is the rarest form of murder. To be called a serial killer, the person has to have individually killed 3 or more people who were previously unknown to them. When someone kills several random people just because it gives them a thrill, the family and friends of their victims understandably want the severest punishment available to the killer. Sometimes this is the death penalty, although more often than not, it is life in prison. Serial killers will have a price on their heads when they enter the prison system, especially if they've killed children. And for some of the world's most notorious killers, inmates have dished out their own punishment for these individuals. It's safe to say that not all murderers die of natural causes, and in this video, we'll be looking at how some of the worst serial killers of all time met their end. Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton's end was particularly brutal. But let's give some backstory behind the man. Robert Pickton was a Canadian serial killer, also known as the pig farmer killer or the butcher. It's believed that between 1995 and 2001, Pickton murdered at least 26 women from Vancouver's downtown east side and fed some of them to his beloved pigs. After his arrest, a search of his farm revealed the remains or DNA of 33 women, out of the 49 he claimed to have killed. Investigators also found human remains, including skulls cut in half and stuffed with human hands and feet. While in custody, Pickton told an undercover police officer posing as a fellow inmate that he wanted to kill one more in order to bring his victim count up to an even 50. During his trial, gruesome details came up about what he did to his victims after luring them to his farm with promises of money. Once there, he would either strangle or shoot them before hanging up their bodies to bleed and gut them. Some of his victims were run through a wood chipper and fed to his pigs. It's also been suggested he minced some of them and added them to the sausages he made on the farm. And when his crimes were discovered, health officials issued a tainted meat advisory to neighbours who might have bought pork from Pickton's farm, concerned the meat might have contained human remains. In 2007, Pickton was tried and convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The remaining 20 murders were officially stayed in 2010. The exact number of women Pickton killed is unknown, but he is widely regarded as one of the worst serial killers in history. So many believe it was karma when on May 19, 2024, Pickton was attacked by a fellow inmate at the Port Cartier institution in Quebec. The prisoner stabbed Pickton in the neck with a toothbrush and shoved a broken broom handle up his nose into his skull. Pickton was rushed to hospital but died on May 31st after his life support was switched off. He was 74 years of age. Denis Nilsen was a prolific Scottish serial killer and necrophile who murdered and tortured at least 12 young men at the 2 North London homes he lived in between 1978 and 1983. Nilsen's first murder occurred 18 months after the breakdown of his relationship with David Gallichan. Nilsen had started drinking and was increasingly lonely. On December 29, 1978, he invited a young man back to his home, but the next morning he couldn't face the man leaving him alone again, so he strangled him and put his head in a bucket of water and drowned him. He then washed the corpse and put it back in his bed, spending the next night sleeping with it and defiling his dead body. He then hid the corpse under his floorboards for 7 months before removing it and burning the decaying remains in his back garden. This was a reoccurring theme for his next 11 victims, retaining their bodies before dissecting them and either burning their remains or flushing them down the toilet. When he later moved to Muswell Hill, London, he continued killing until the flesh started blocking up his drains. When Nilsen called out to a specialist to unblock the drains, his grisly crimes were discovered. After his arrest, Nilsen immediately provided exhaustive details about his killing spree, admitting to killing 15 young men and attempting to murder 7 others. He showed zero remorse for his crimes. At his trial, he pleaded not guilty despite his previous confessions, citing diminished responsibility due to mental defect. However, the physical evidence was too much and included a cooking pot that Nilsen used to boil skulls, and on November 3, 1983, Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison without eligibility for parole for at least 25 years. This was later changed to a whole life tariff in December 1994, which effectively meant Nilsen would never be released from prison, a punishment he accepted and declined to appeal. After spending 35 years incarcerated, on May 12, 2018, Denis Nilsen died in agony at HMP Full Sutton in East Yorkshire. 2 days before his death, he was found doubled over in agony on the floor of his cell. He was unable to move and was lying in feces, but he refused to go to hospital. At around 5 p.m. the same day, Nilsen's condition deteriorated and an ambulance was called. Paramedics found that he had a pulsating abdominal mass, which was later found to be the ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the hospital, he had surgery but died 2 days later after being unable to cope with the blood loss and stress of the lengthy surgery. His final hours were spent in agony. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was an American serial killer who between 1978 and 1991 killed and dismembered 17 young men. Dahmer lured his victims from gay bars, malls and bus stops with promises of sex or money. However, when they went back to his apartment in Milwaukee, he laced their drinks with drugs before strangling them when they fell unconscious. He then defiled their corpses and took Polaroid pictures of them in suggested positions so he could relive the experience at a later date. Dahmer disposed of some of the bodies by dissolving them in acid in a drum he had in his apartment. With some of his later victims, Dahmer started developing rituals with his victims and even attempted crude lobotomies, drilling a hole into the skull of Errol Lindsay while he was still alive and injecting him with muriatic acid before strangling him. If all this wasn't bad enough, he also ate the flesh of some of his victims. Dahmer first started his murder spree while living with his parents, and then later with his grandmother, and had killed 5 people before he moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A further 12 victims were killed in this apartment, making a total of 17. Dahmer was finally caught on July 22, 1991, after one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, escaped Dahmer's apartment, still handcuffed and flagged down a police car. When officers arrived at Dahmer's apartment, they were not expecting to find what they did. A total of 4 human heads were found in the kitchen, 7 skulls, some painted in the bedroom. In the refrigerator were 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle. In the freezer was a whole torso, as well as other human remains found in a bag. Elsewhere in the apartment were 2 complete skeletons and other body parts. And inside a 57-gallon blue drum, there were more torsos dissolving in acid. After his arrest, Dahmer readily admitted to all 17 murders. At his trial, he was convicted of 15 murders in Wisconsin and 1 in Ohio, and sentenced to life in prison. He was described as a sane man in full control of his actions. He would be killed on November 28, 1994. While serving his sentence in Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Dahmer was assigned to work with 2 other convicted murderers, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. After the trio were left alone, the guards returned to find Scarver had brutally beaten Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar. Dahmer died en route to Divine Savior Hospital. The autopsy report stated that Dahmer died from a massive crushing head injury with extensive skull and facial fractures, lacerations of face and scalp, and inhalation of blood. His cause of death was blunt force assault. Anderson, who was in prison for murdering his wife, also died of his injuries days later. Scarver later said, "God told me to do it." He told the New York Post that he was disturbed not only by Dahmer's crimes, but by a habit Dahmer had developed of fashioning severed limbs from prison food to antagonize other inmates. Scarver also claimed that prison guards allowed the murders to happen by leaving them alone. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey doesn't pique the public interest as much as some other serial killers, but Harvey is one of the most prolific mass murderers in United States history. From the age of 18, Harvey worked as an orderly at hospitals in Ohio and Kentucky, and initially his co-workers joked about the number of patients who died whilst he was on duty, giving him the nickname Kiss of Death. But because most of the patients were very ill or elderly, their deaths did not arouse suspicion. However, after he killed John Powell, who had been admitted to hospital after a motorcycle accident and died unexpectedly, a post-mortem was performed, and the doctor detected the telltale scent of cyanide in his stomach cavity. Harvey became a suspect after investigators learned he had been forced to resign from the Cincinnati VA hospital after he was caught stealing body parts for occult rituals. As soon as he was brought in for questioning, he confessed to killing Powell, claiming he had euthanized him with cyanide. More confessions followed in 1987, and Harvey pleaded guilty to killing 21 patients at Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital in the 1980s, 13 patients at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky in 1970 and 1971. Harvey killed most of his victims by poisoning them with substances like cyanide, rat poison, petroleum distillate or arsenic, which he often mixed into drinks or food like freshly baked pie. Others were suffocated in their hospital beds, either with their pillows or by oxygen tanks that he refused to refill. 3 of his victims were not hospital patients. One was a neighbor, who he gave an arsenic-laced pie. Another was his roommate's father, and the third was an acquaintance. Harvey confessed to many more victims than he was convicted of, and the true number of his victims is unknown. He claimed he killed to ease the suffering of his patients, but eventually he just killed for enjoyment. In 1987, Harvey was sentenced to 28 consecutive life sentences. On March 28, 2017, he was found severely beaten in his cell. His injuries proved to be fatal, and he died 2 days later, aged 64. Fellow inmate James Elliott was later charged with aggravated murder and other charges related to the death of Donald Harvey, after he admitted to plotting the assault at least a week before it happened. He later wrote in a letter, "Hopefully, everyone from our area will take some solace in the fact that one of their own gave Harvey the punishment that he should have gotten from the courts." Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a female American serial killer who, whilst working as a prostitute on Florida's highways, shot dead and robbed 7 men. Her killing spree started around late November 1989 and earned her the nickname Damsel of Death. She would kill her victims, then steal their possessions, even their cars, and pawn the items using fake names. Wuornos always claimed she killed the men in self-defense after they attacked her. However, she later retracted that statement, and police believed she had killed men who'd either picked her up or had stopped to help her on the highway. On January 27, 1992, a jury found 35-year-old Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder and robbery, and she was sentenced to death, even though her sanity was questioned. Wuornos was only convicted of 6 murders. She was not charged with the 7th, Peter Seams, whose body has never been found, but he was one of her victims. Her story was told in the 2003 movie Monster, where Wuornos was played by Charlize Theron, who won an Oscar for her portrayal. In the weeks before her execution, after spending 10 years on death row, Wuornos gave a series of interviews to documentarian Nick Broomfield, in which she accused prison authorities of poisoning her. Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." On October 9, 2002, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She declined her last meal and opted for a cup of coffee instead. Her last words were, "Yes, I would just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." She died at 9:47 a.m. local time, and became only the 2nd woman in Florida to be executed since capital punishment was restored in 1976. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered under a tree in Michigan. Natalie Merchant's song Carnival was played at her funeral, the same song used in the closing credits of Nick Broomfield's documentary, Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. So, that's the story behind how these 5 serial killers met their end. We'll have another one of these videos coming soon, telling you how Israel Keyes, Andrei Chikatilo, John Wayne Gacy, Fred West, and Pedro Filo met their end. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another video.